can we talk, first of all, about how you became interested in this subject? Right? What was it that brought you to write this book?
Well, I was never interested in reading other than to read. And I had a full writing program for years and years. But in the back of my mind, I kept on getting really distracted by the fact, can you hear me, by the way? Is it loud enough? Distracted by the fact that reading has become such a problem in our society. And I was really struck by the way in which, for example, teachers I talked to were complaining about the difficulties they had in getting children to gain a love of reading or to gain pleasure from reading. And I began to notice that even at the university where I work, a lot of the students would resent the fact that in my course you had to read whole books. And they would say, you know, Professor Furedi, in all these other courses we get handouts, or you can read just 10 pages, and that's all right. And what happened was, I wrote an article about this for the Sunday Times, where I basically made the point that it's really weird that in university, where people go because they want to, nobody is forcing you to go to university, a lot of people were kicking up against the idea of reading. And not only that, but a lot of academics, my colleagues, were complicit in allowing it to occur. I mean, myself, I wouldn't allow that, because otherwise I might as well, sort of get a different job. So anyways, next day, 2 days after I wrote the article, I got a letter from not the vice chancellor, but the guy below the vice chancellor of my university, writing a very irate letter to me saying, Frank, I thought the irate letter would merely say that you're lying, you're making this up. Universities, people are reading, literature is flourishing. But that's not what he said. He said, Frank, what I don't understand is why are you privileging the book? And at that point, I took a gulp. This is like it's a big university. It's quite a prestigious university in many ways. And here's a number 2 in the university giving me a little lecture as to why, I shouldn't be privileging, the book. He says there's other ways of communicating. Of course there are. You can give them the phone book. You can, do all kinds of stuff. And at that point, that was the first time I realized that something had changed. And then I realized, then I had a number of other experiences. For example, I had a son late in life. And we arrived at the school. My wife and I didn't realize that the world had changed. In our days, you went to the school next to your house, the nearest school. Nobody did that where we lived. So we were told, you must go to see every single school. And every single school we went to, the teachers would say, the headmistress would say, the headmaster would say, Professor Furedi, wonderful you're here. We have very good news for you. And I would say, what's the good news? And the good news was that we have a wonderful dyslexia unit. Straight away. And I said, why are you telling me that? Is there something I should know about my son that I don't know? What's going on? And of course, the presumption was that boys are not interested in reading, number 1. And the second presumption was that a very large number of children are automatically dyslexic, And when my wife said, well, how many of the kids go to a dyslexic unit in your school? They said about 25%. And when I heard that, I knew that something profoundly had changed. And so a year or 2 later, I was struggling. I was avoiding trying to write about this. But then one day I realized that something fundamental has changed, which is this. Throughout human history, people learned to read for themselves. I don't know if you realize, but the vast majority of working class people in England learned how to read either by themselves or with the help of their family members. They didn't need teachers or wonderful reading schemes that we now have. They just learned how to read before you had the introduction of public education. But not only that, the problem throughout history was that people read too much. Most of the complaints that people had about people, why are you spending so much time reading? Why don't you take your responsibilities seriously? Whereas today what we have is a situation where teaching of reading is a problem. We medicalize reading, and we assume that it's a difficult art to do something that for almost like 2,000 years was a taken for granted activity. And one last point. Throughout human history, reading was associated with democratic transformation, with progressive ideals, with people taking control over their destiny, gaining gaining clarity about the intellectual world. Whereas reading today is increasingly seen as a lost art. We kind of complain about the internet, we complain about this technology and that. And all of a sudden, something that has been a very positive dimension of our experience is now seen as almost like kind of a difficult accomplishment, or alternatively, we kind of medicalize it. And the number of children in schools, who are given various diagnoses as either not being able to read, or they got attention deficit this or dyslexia that, is just expanding and expanding on a regular basis. I mean, if you look at the statistics, it's almost like a reverse L in terms of the way that we pathologize young people and we medicalize their reading abilities. So that's why I got interested in saying, well, what has changed? And that's why I did a history of reading.
Can we come back to some of those issues in a moment? But first of all, I'd like you to tell us how you yourself, you grew up in Hungary, you left home when you were 16. How were you taught to read? And what was it that you enjoyed reading as a young man?
Well, I was very lucky. I mean, I come from a family that's totally uneducated. I'm the first person to finish school. My mother almost finished school, but not quite. My dad left school when he was 14. But they were all interested in books, and they were determined that I should be interested in books as well. So in Hungary, this is like in the height of the Stalinist period when things are pretty grim. One Christmas, my father said to me, I think I was 5.5 or 6, he said, I've got a deal for you. And the deal is, I'll give you the equivalent of £5 in Hungarian currency.
Which would be a lot of money.
Yeah, it was a lot of money. If you read this. And he opened up a cupboard, and there were about 15 books that he bought for Christmas for me. And that was at that point I hadn't been in school yet, and that was my introduction. So basically, here's his 15 books. And when I started reading, it was a struggle, because my father wasn't in a position to teach me how to read. I had to kind of go around and ask people.
So was there a key person who could tell you what a particular group of letters said? My
elder sister,
right,
who was the first Furedi to finish high school.
Right.
I'm the second high school graduate. Anyways, she actually explained to me what the alphabet was and everything else. And then I kind of figured it out for myself. But the great thing was that when I started reading, I did it for the money, I have to be honest, sort of. But after the third book, I kind of didn't need the money anymore, because you were kind of transported into that. And that's probably the single best thing that ever happened to me. And this was by a man who was working like 60, 70 hours a week, very little education, but he had the intelligence to know that there's an easy way of getting a young kid to become inspired by the love of reading.
So he had obviously had access to the books and been able to get them. He'd not got through school himself, so could he read?
Oh yeah, he was an avid reader.
Right.
And he just read all the time, and he got into a lot of trouble because of that, because he was arrested in 1955 because he was reading books that the government wouldn't allow, they were being read secretly.
Right.
And he just couldn't resist the temptation of finishing the book when there were other people moving in. So basically, he got arrested, spent 2 months in jail for reading what they called Western propaganda, okay, which was basically a book by Orwell, translated into Hungarian, which he kind of enjoyed.
And can you remember what any of those books in that cupboard were about?
I do. I remember very clearly. They were merely, sort of the Hungarian equivalent of English literature that you give to kids, and most of them were
fairy tales.
Fairy tales, like like Grimm's and things like that. But there was one book that I read in particular. There's a national poet called József Attila, and it was his poems that got me, completely grabbed my attention, because they had this kind of lyrical intensity that could appeal to a child, which is, good poetry should be like that. Good poetry doesn't have to be for eggheads. I mean, a good poem with a rhythm, and in fact, I always tell people who got children that the best thing you could do if you want to get them to, want to turn them on to reading, is to give them poetry at a very early age. Because, poetry's got this oral aspect about it that you can pick up when you're very, very young. You don't need to even be able to read to get into the rhythm and learn from that.
Well, both nursery rhymes and some of the books that we do introduce young children to are in rhyming couplets. So the child remembers the words and then follows
right.
the text.
Yes.
And that's a joyful way to approach reading.
It is, yes. And in fact, when I was doing a bit of teaching in Africa, I had this trick that I developed where I would read out half the poem, and then I would do my father's trick of saying, well, if you can read the rest of the poem effectively and get the rhythm, I'll give you a sweet or something. I'm into bribery big time, by the way, I should say. So I've got no problems with that. And the kids the fact that you read half the poem and they were waiting for its resolution meant that there's an incentive for them to just get into the poems and try to kind of decipher it and decode the words and work it out for themselves.
And would you agree that at that stage, reading had a very high status? So it was something people aspired to and saw as a way forward?
I think that's true. I think that when we were forced to leave Hungary when I was 9, and we moved to Canada, and I remember all the immigrant refugee children that I talked to all had this. There was a kind of absolute understanding that the way you make your way in the world was by becoming a good reader. It sounded very instrumental, but the nice thing was that at a certain point, what begins as an instrumental, utilitarian reason for reading overwhelms you, and you kind of begin to read just because it's good, and it becomes. I think what happens, you begin to realize that books are like doors that open themselves to a new world, and I think that's what many of us discovered.
I remember I've got a colleague of mine who I used to work with in Bradford, a mum who herself had not had access to education, but she knew how important reading was. So she took all 4 of her children to the local library, and every week each child borrowed 4 books. And they then looked at them, the children were reading to each other, and then at the end of the week, she hadn't lost the books, which I'd have done. They all went back and changed the books. But it was about her knowing what she should do, even though she herself hadn't had access to education.
Yeah.
Your book is also incredibly well researched. Can I ask how long it took you? I mean, as I've gone through, I've thought, I think this would have taken me years.
Well, if I give you an idea, one of the chapters, I wrote a chapter on Augustine, who was a Christian theologian. I'm not a Christian myself or even religious, but he's the first person to write about the experience of reading in a theoretical kind of a way, and I was really interested in reading his Confessions. So I said to myself, well, I'll give myself a month to kind of research Augustine, and then maybe another month to write it, because I'm a very fast writer. I ended up spending a year on medieval theories of literature. So to get an idea, it took me a very long. I mean, I was working on other things, but what was originally a year-long project kept on extending, and in fact, sort of when I wrote the book, this never happened to me before. The book was actually 3 times as long as what you've got here, just because I had so many historical chapters. But then I realized that, maybe I'm being a bit indulgent, and I don't want to, so make life too difficult for my readers. So I took a lot of the historical chapters out, and I'm saving them for another opportunity.
A sequel. Yeah.
Yeah, another opportunity, because sort of you got to kind of sort of hold the line. But it was tremendously. I mean, for me, this was an entirely new initiative, because I'm a sociologist, and most of my work is in social sciences, and this is the first time that I, kind of occupied this territory on the boundaries of sociology, literature, and philosophy and history. Those kind of 4 areas, and it was really good fun to go back and forth between philosophy and literature and sociology, and just to kind of extract from that what I thought were the key themes.
Right. Were there any surprises? So when you were composing and crafting the text, you were encountering these great historic figures. Was there anyone that surprised you with what they were saying?
Well, there were a lot of surprises along the way. I mean, it was almost like a love affair, because I kept falling in love with different people. You know, I don't know if that's ever happened to you when you're reading something and you get caught unaware. So, for example, I never particularly liked Machiavelli. You know, sort of, I didn't dislike him, but Machiavelli is somebody I had to put up with in political theory courses in university. But his discourses on reading are just a joy to read. You know, he's got this little story when he was in exile, that he's in exile and he doesn't know what to do with himself. So every night, well, every day he takes a little book and reads from it, sort of in the countryside, and sort of, and he kind of gets inspired by it. But in the evenings he goes home and he gets dressed up, he puts on his nicest clothes, he makes a little kind of dinner for himself, and he says, I'm having conversations with all these great authors from the past, all the ancients. And for him, reading becomes the medium through which he's having a conversation with the past. And because of that conversation in the past, he's actually learning about his own circumstance, to the point at which that his famous book, The Prince, I don't know if any of you ever read it, the Prince is actually a product of this kind of conversation that he's having. The person I really fell in love with, and that's partially because I'm not English originally. I should have known the person already, Milton. I mean, reading Milton's Milton's Paradise Lost was complete revelation to me, and I felt really embarrassed that in my declining years I still hadn't read him yet. So there was, you realize how, I mean, not only was he a fighter for free speech and for freedom, and not only was he on the right side in the Civil War, but he also had this incredible trust in people's and readers' ability to think for themselves in a way that in the current era we're very, we don't have that kind of trust. We don't trust people to make up their own mind. We always got to give them very helpful advice. But Milton was a very robust, radical thinker, and his poetry and his idea of the world are indissolubly linked, and really kind of helped me along and in fact, even now, whenever I feel a bit down about the world, picking up Milton I find a very helpful way of giving me a kick up the rear end, I suppose.
And you start, I mean, the title, From Socrates to Twitter, you start with the Greeks, you start with Socrates. Could you share with us what you found out their thoughts were? What were the debates then?
Well, I mean, Socrates is very important. And I think this is something that is relevant for now, because Socrates is the first person who issues a health warning about the dangers of reading. And that health warning will reoccur time and time again. In his dialogue on Phaedrus, what Socrates says is that actually the invention of writing is a problem, because if we rely on writing, then we will have memory loss. We will lose our memories, and we will not be able to remember what has gone on beforehand. And I mean, Socrates is really Plato writing to the master of Socrates. But what Socrates is saying is that reading is dangerous, because unlike in a dialogue between me and Maggie, where we could take each other up and argue and resolve differences and come to conclusions, when somebody reads something, there's nobody there to correct them. And he had a slightly patronizing attitude towards the reader. The assumption was that most people lack the intellectual resources to be able to handle complex arguments, and therefore it would get in the wrong hands and would have negative consequences. So the reason why I became interested in Socrates and some of the Greeks is that no sooner was writing invented and people began to read than you had the very first attempt to turn reading into a problem. So from that point onwards, every single generation, so in the hundreds of years, thousands of years since then, there's always been an argument that reading is either dangerous or a problem. Socrates called reading pharmakon, which is the Greek word for a drug. And therefore, reading for him was both a cure, but also a cause of illness. So that kind of paradox of reading will reoccur in the centuries to come, which is why I thought it's a nice place to begin the writing. Also, I love the Greeks. They're very fascinating. But that's a personal obsession, so it's kind of...
And the issues carried on into the Middle Ages?
It did, and I think it's interesting that from that point onwards, you will have, if you after Socrates, you have, I don't know if any of you ever encountered Seneca or Cicero in Rome, and they had this big complaint, and their complaint was the very opposite of our complaint. Their complaint was that if you read too many books, you're going to get mentally disoriented and confused, and it's far better that you just read a few books and reread them and just keep it at that. And as you get into the medieval era, what happens is that the warnings that Socrates issued are recast increasingly in medical terms. And you have all these stories of people saying, oh, I read the book and I became so absorbed in the book. I'm so into this book that I'm lost sight of my responsibilities. And as a result of that, I ended up doing all these terrible things. So the blaming of the media for our failures actually begins with the book and continues now. Can I tell a wonderful story from Dante? There's a wonderful story. I don't know if any of you ever read Dante's, sort of story of people walking around in the inferno, sort of in the dark world. And there's this wonderful story it tells of Paolo and Francesca. And basically what happened was that Paolo and Francesca were killed by Francesca's husband. And the reason why Francesca's husband killed Paolo and Francesca is because of what happened beforehand. And what happened beforehand was that Paolo and Francesca were innocently reading a book together, a novel together. And the novel was about Guinevere and Sir Lancelot, and the romance, the Arthurian romance, which they were kind of reading innocently. And in this, as during the novel, you kind of get to the story where Guinevere kisses Lancelot. And when Francesca explaining why they were killed, he turns to Dante and says, and when we read that, we looked at each other in the eye and we stopped reading. And that story of illicit love brought on by a book, a story, would be repeated hundreds, thousands of times by various Christian theologians and various Puritans as a warning to all good men and women against the dangers of reading romantic fiction. And it's interesting how, reading itself then becomes an argument against reading, sort of at that time.
I'm going to ask you to read a tiny bit here from page 161. I just noticed a couple of bits. But if you could just read that, just part of that paragraph there.
Right. More than 1,000 years before the invention of printing, Seneca sarcastically drew attention to the fad for the ostentatious display of the books. Many people without a school education use books not only as tools for study, but as decorations for dining room, he stated. Of the avid collector of scrolls, he wrote, you can see the complete works of orators and historians on shelves up to the ceilings, because like bathrooms, a library has become an essential ornament of a rich house.
And I just wondered, I thought about my own house, which is full of books, but it reminded me of a friend of mine who said she was living at a time in a place where not many of her neighbours had books, and she was walking down this road in Halifax and looked in and saw a house that was absolutely full of books and thought, I'm going to get to know that person. That person is going to be somebody that I will feel close to. And then she looked again and realised it was wallpaper.
Yes, well, yeah.
So we can find books and lose books, and books can be in many ways. Do you think in time books will change? I mean, we're living here just down the road from Otley, where they invented and produced the flatbread printer.
Yeah.
And that gave us printing machines that went all over the empire and made print readily available. And are we not valuing the text itself enough? Might we get to a time when a book is a rare and beautiful thing?
Well, I mean, some books are rare and beautiful even now, but I think your question is a very important one. One of the things that I learned I was wrong about when I started working on the book, you see, is that the book isn't as much threatened by cultural pressure as I thought it was. When I started writing the book, I was partially writing it to defend the idea of a book,
Yeah.
and to kind of hold the ground for reading, because I had read all these reports about how nobody's reading and the book is disappearing and all the rest of that. And by the time I finished, I realized that actually the book was always in crisis. I mean, successive generations had a different story about why the book was in crisis and why reading was a problem. And I think, so to today, I think what's very interesting is that despite the phenomenon of the e-books, which is not a problem, by the way, I mean, e-books are perfectly all right, that despite the invention of Kinder and the internet and all the texting you see and everything else, reading still continues to be very important. But what needs to be understood is that its importance is a very segmented one. So we don't read any less than ever before. I mean, that's a myth, that we're reading less than ever before. And arguably, we read far more than at any other time in human history. We might be reading the wrong things. So when I arrive at Leeds Station today, every single human being in the station is texting. I mean, it's just weird. So it's almost like there's a kind of performance of reading. It's a real kind of performance that you kind of put on. But then I think, well, is this performance of reading all that different to the 16th, 17th century, where every single portrait you see is a lady or a gentleman with a book? I mean, if you go to the National Portrait Gallery, you cannot see a portrait in the 16th, 17th, 18th century without either sitting like this or sitting near a book. So now the texting thing has become, in many respects, the functional equivalent of that. They're both superficial, performative activities. But what I learned from writing this book is that despite all the philistinism about reading, and there's a lot of philistinism, and despite the fact that that we do a lot of instrumental reading, we read not for the sake of reading, but because of a means to acquire another end, there's still a substantial minority of people who take reading seriously, and it's always been like that. I mean, in the 19th century, good readers were a minority. In the 20th century, good readers were a minority, and that's always been like that. And therefore, the challenge for people like myself is to try to, at least, expand that minority or even make it a majority, sort of.
But we still do have a section of our community that are unable to read. And it seems there's still sections of the community that are failed by the schooling system, in that they are not competent and comfortable with text.
Yeah.
So is reading still a privilege for the elite?
Not necessarily, because throughout human history, people who were reacting against the elite or rising up had no problems learning how to read. I mean, Welsh miners in the 19th century, sort of used to go home at night and learn to read for themselves so they could read Marx's Capital, and didn't need the elites or even teachers to show them how to do that. If there is something really strong that is being communicated, people will be drawn towards that, either in literature or in other types of text. I think that the real problem in the 21st century is not the institutional ones or even education. I got problems with education, but I think the real problem is that for a lot of people, reading is not a big deal because what they want to read or the content of what's offered to them isn't compelling. So for me, the real crisis today is that of content rather than anything else. It's the content and the lack of inspiration that the content gives people, the lack of relevance that it has for people's lives. That is the issue for me, rather than the fact that schools are maybe letting people down, or in some shape or form, children are not being inspired by teachers. I think that, if you look at history, people do not need institutions and teachers. They will do it for themselves if there's a good reason for them to do it, and we're not giving them the good reason at the moment.
Well, we've got 1.5 million children leave school without being able to read, so
Yeah.
I think that's a sadness for all of us in terms of the opportunities denied to that section of the population. Now,
Yeah.
be they mainly boys, be they people from a certain group of society, be they people who we know that the prison population, when we look at that, contains many people who are not competent in reading and thus able to access a future for themselves.
Sure. But I think the real problem, I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
But that problem is made worse by the fact that when I don't want to be critical of anybody in this room, unless you're teachers, but often I go to schools, and instead of giving children books to read, you get these worksheets. So I don't know if you know what I mean, but these horribly boring worksheets. And I know that if that's what I was brought up on, I would be, sort of.
Sorry, I'm trying to
it's all
check
right.
the time on this, and I'm pushing the wrong button.
I know that if I was given those worksheets when I was young, I don't think that one could develop a love of reading from those kind of sort of things. So I think that in many respects, there's nothing we can do in the realm of education about the inequalities of our society, but there's a lot we could do to educate people by giving them the right kind of stuff.
I certainly think to give them a diet of narrative that is both exciting and stimulating. At the festival we've had Steve Cole here today, who has been engaging teachers and before that children, and talking about the value of using story and the value of encouraging children. If we go back a step, we perhaps also need to develop our children as communicators, as in speakers.
Yes.
Before we move them to be both writers and readers.
Yeah, I think that any good school understands that the key to developing the personality of young people, children in particular, is to encouraging them to voice an opinion. I think voicing an opinion is really the first act in education. It's a prelude to be able to understand subjects, but also as a way of integrating and assimilating subjects, because very often when you're very young, the way you learn is by voicing it in your head. It's almost like you're having an inner conversation with yourself. And the more you can externalize that, the better the quality of your intellectual educational experience.
You also talk about the range of literacies. Would you like to say something about?
Well, this is something I learned in the course of writing the books, and it's probably my pet hatred that kind of emerges from this, which is one of the things that has occurred, which is in many respects a symptom of our intellectual malaise, is that we react to the problem of reading and the problem of reading words, literacy, word literacy, by saying, and you must, if there's any teachers amongst you, I'm sure you must have heard it, when people say, oh little Johnny, little Mary, it doesn't matter that you cannot read, because reading literacy is only one literacy amongst many. And every single week I hear a new literacy. This week I heard of financial literacy. The week before that I heard of environmental literacy, of emotional literacy. In the university we have communication literacy, information literacy, computer literacy, sex literacy. I mean, you can just go on and on. Everything is rebranded as a literacy. And the upshot of all this process is you actually devalue what is real literacy. You basically are using the prestige and the cultural status of reading as a way of suggesting that the reading of a book, the intellectual experience that the reading of the book has, is the functional equivalent of knowing how to basically add up, your mortgage payments, which is financial literacy. So that in universities we now have, I'm not making this up, even in Cambridge, which is a pretty good university, we now teach young people information literacy, which in my days used to be called going to the library. Right? I mean, fairly soon we're going to have shoelace literacy, where young people are educated in the skills of how to tie their shoelaces. But literally everything becomes a literacy. In the course of doing that, the power of reading and its real meaning as a kind of proper experience becomes totally devalued, and it allows us to evade the fact that we're not teaching young people to read properly, because it's no big deal. It's just one literacy amongst many, and I think that's one of the things I learned is a problem that needs to be confronted and articulated.
And what do you think the future holds for us in relation to reading and writing?
I think a lot depends on ourselves. I think that we need to raise the bar and particularly expect a lot more from young people. I mean, I mentioned high universities. We now take reading as a big deal, and a lot of academics say, you know, little Mary there is a good reader, as if that's an unusual accomplishment for a 20-year-old young woman to be a good reader. You expect university students to want to read. Well, you roll the film backwards, and we have a similar attitude in schools, where we have this kind of assumption. Well, number one assumption is boys don't like reading. I mean, I don't know where that comes from. But everywhere I go, you know, Frank, it's so difficult to get boys to read. So the upshot of that is that we kind of write off a third of the boys because that's what they like. You know, fatalistically, we just go like this. And not only that, but we have this kind of almost an infantilized process where we treat children childishly. I mean, one of my other bugbears is that we have this idea that the way you teach young people how to read is by giving them material that's really relevant to their lives. Really, really relevant. Well, you know, where I come from, the more relevant it is, the most boring. It's the most boring way of turning people off. If you're gonna get a book about the street that you live on, you know, why would you want to read about it? I mean, you know what the experience is like. And it was not for nothing that one of the few books that turned young people on to reading was Harry Potter. Now, you can say many things about Harry Potter. You don't have to like it, but the one thing it wasn't was relevant to people's lives. I mean, most people didn't live in that kind of world. And I think that what Harry Potter showed us is that the more you can transpose young people into a different world, open up their imagination, show them different possibilities, the more they can transcend the limitations of their circumstances. And this goes particularly for working class children, from people from backgrounds that are fairly poor in terms of possibilities. The more you can get them to see that there's a different way of living, the more reading becomes a little bit magical. And not only that, and this is something that we're forgetting, the more you begin to use slightly more morally challenging and slightly more complex vocabulary. I mean, kids love, you know, big words. You know, not very many of them, but if you give them a few big words now and again, they're not going to say, "Oh, Professor Furedi, that's a big word. You know, I'm too young for that." They will kind of struggle with it and make that make it their own. And I think if you can have a reading culture that's, you know, raises the bar a bit and challenges people, instead of treating children as if they're morons, which is very often what happens at the moment, then you can use the energy and the idealism of youth to begin to, you know, sort of challenge our slightly, you know, sort of boring reading culture at the moment. And I'm very optimistic because whenever I talk to 16, 17, 18-year-olds, you know, they're just buzzing with ideas. I did a talk 3 weeks ago to a bunch of 17, they were doing their A-levels, just started doing their A-levels. And a whole group of them came in, you know, and this is the minority readers I'm talking about. They all come in, they're all wearing these dark clothes. I don't know what kind of subculture that they were. And they all had a copy of Jean-Paul Sartre's, you know, sort of you know, first novel of the trilogy. I said, my God, this is quite impressive. You know, the little existentialists kind of walk in, you know, really, and all that they are is just very idealistic. And that to me is the model of what you want to encourage at that age.
So it's access to material.
Yeah.
It's inspirational people around them using text. Yeah.
And taking them really seriously, you know, that's really important. You know, that you don't treat them childishly, you take them seriously as potential budding intellectuals, even at a very early age.
Shall we take some questions? Is there anyone that would like to ask Frank something about what he said? Nigel.
I read English at university. My inspirations were, on the one hand, a very inspiring teacher at school who taught me the value of literature, not just reading and then also my grandmother, who left school when she was 14, but was such an avid reader, she would go to the library twice a week sometimes and get out 4 books and read them in no time. And she would talk to me about books often. I just think we
So there are parallels here, aren't there, with
but I think
members
we should
of...
all be protesting vociferously about the closure of libraries
Yes.
in particular.
Yes, absolutely.
And we don't shout loud enough about it. I wondered what your thoughts were about that, Professor.
Well, I feel very strongly about libraries because I always think that one of the easiest ways of getting young people, kids, acquainted with books is turning that very first time they go into a library into an adventure. And if you understand children and their kind of aspiration to be grown-ups rather than children, then that adventure of going to the library can go on and on and on and on and on. And people don't realize that a library isn't just a building, with books in it, but it's a place where, sort of it becomes, in many ways, the first kind of territory where kids can make the learning of ideas of their own in a way that's different in a classroom. And one of the things that I feel, absolutely horrified by is that you get all these this began with New Labour and it's now going on with the Tories. All these people coming along and say, but Frank, I don't know what the fuss is, We're turning these libraries into digital hubs. I mean, every time I hear the word hub, I feel like shooting somebody. A digital hub, we serve coffee there. I mean, these people are not addicted to coffee. That's not really why they're here. But the way that the library has been rebranded as a place where there's all these gadgets and there's coffee machines. Now we get in universities. I mean, you come to my university, and it looks like a lounge in an airport. I mean, the odd book is still there, but increasingly, it's kind of becoming extinguished. And I think that, if I was a librarian, I'd feel I want to commit suicide almost because, being a librarian is to me, is one of the most honorable vocations I can think of. And the amount of, good librarians have done for me over the years, I've used them, I relied on them, they've inspired me. I mean, a good librarian is just worth their weight in gold. I mean, they know everything about the books and they know where to get them and access them. And we're turning what is a really honorable profession into these de-skilled providers of coffee. So I am horrified by that. In fact, I'm just writing an article for a newspaper at the moment, which argues that one of the most important things is that libraries need to be kind of almost like reinvented. Because if for no other reason than for the younger generation, so that the experience of going to a library, so that crucial experience is available to a lot more people rather than, sort of them being denied by that.
There has been an emergence of reading groups, hasn't there?
Yes.
Many people belong to a book group where they meet and discuss something, a book or an article or a series of books that they've been looking at. Are you hopeful that will continue to expand, and perhaps we should look at that sort of thing happening in schools where we get the children to form groups and read and discuss?
I'm a bit ambivalent about it. I mean, I'm in a reading group myself, right. And I really enjoy because the people in my reading group are people I would never mix with. I hope this is not recorded, but they're not people I would normally sort of encounter, and that's good. Yeah. The downside, and it's also it's a nice social occasion because it's a way of forging friendships around books. In my book club, within half an hour, the discussion turns into the film that's being made about the book, or something, kind of people are very fast at going off. Maybe it's just my book club, but that's not an argument against book clubs. It just indicates that its main motivation is a social one. But obviously, it's good that the social motivation is done through the medium of books rather than of something else. What I'm really hopeful about are initiatives like yours. I mean, there are so many literature festivals around at the moment, all over Europe. I've been in Lviv the couple of months ago, which is in western Ukraine, and I think there was like 4,000 or 5,000 people at this literature festival. Everybody's talking about books. You go to Modena in Italy, and for 3 days, the whole town does nothing else but discuss philosophy. So you can really see there's a tremendous thirst out there by a significant minority of people. It's really there. It's just that it hasn't got the kind of valuation within mainstream society, that it really needs. And I also think that people like ourselves are often not confident enough to demand that reading should be taken much more seriously. That reading isn't just a personal sort of obsession or a kind of a small minority's activity, but it's something that's got tremendous importance for the future of society.
Another question? Anyone?
Because I'm an English teacher and I do try obviously every day, every lesson to inspire people into reading and often give them reasons. But in your opinion, if you had to sell reading to somebody who wasn't a reader, who hadn't, some alien that's dropped onto our planet and never read before, how would you inspire them? What would you say that they would get out of reading?
Well, what years are we talking about?
I do 11 to 18.
Yeah. I think that there's a different challenge with the 11s as opposed to the 18s, so that with the 11-year-olds, I mean, the trick that I advocate, I hate that using the word trick, but the tactic that I always use is I would begin myself by reading out an interesting story. Sort of something that I think is quite compelling, either because of the incredible language that's being used, or because it's got a compelling narrative attached to it. And I would kind of stop towards the conclusion, sort of kind of hold them in midair and say, here it is, you got to finish this, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. I would never talk about inspiring them, this is what it does for you, anything like that, because the minute you do that, it sounds too much like it's a worthy activity. It's almost like you got to do it from within, find ways and means of seducing people in the way that you were seduced, by, and kind of projecting that onto young people. And I think that, so it will work with a substantial number of people. There are some people that are, for one reason or another, so culturally isolated or so turned off by everything around them that they're not even listening to anything that you say. But most people, I think, most young people, 11, 12, 13, are up for it. I think in Britain, the big tragedy is that it's not particularly difficult getting 9 to 13-year-olds to read, but something happens when the hormones kick in, and boys discover girls and girls discover boys, and you have all this other stuff going on. And for some reason, there's a kind of fall in interest in reading for a while. I think that's the real challenge, to make sure that the fall is limited, and if anything, we're using their early teenage years for good effect.
I think the availability of good quality narrative. I mean, when I was at school, we were read to. And certainly I remember a teacher at secondary school who would read sections to us. And she had such a strong voice that it resonated. And if she'd stopped, you wanted to see what was happening next. And I certainly at primary school now, I don't think there are opportunities for children to be read to rather than to be taught. There's a sense that you must do this, do that, and then assess what you've done. Whereas the rich narrative, which is what I think you've come back to again and again, is what can be inspiring. But we haven't talked about what is behind us.
What is behind us?
A large television screen.
Yeah.
It's...
I've got no problem with new technology or TV. I think that, we often, we have, every time a new media comes along, it gets blamed for the fall in reading. Well, as it happens, young people don't watch very much TV anymore. It's people my age that are the avid TV watchers. They're on internet all the time, right? I mean, if you look at the stats, there's a massive increase in internet. But the interesting thing is that what all the surveys show us is that those young people who are really savvy, internet savvy, and really know how to handle digital technology also read more than anybody else do. So there's no contradiction between being, sort of engaged on the internet, knowing how to use it, and also reading. I mean, they're not antithetical activities. I mean, the things can be mutually reinforcing, and I think we very often, sort of avoid the problems that confront us by saying the internet age is an age of distraction. I got an article in Independent today on this, where it's argued that somehow all this technology is going to distract us from good books. That I don't think is a problem. I think the problem that we have is a cultural one, and it's one that culturally we cannot give meaning, or we find it very difficult to give meaning to good reading. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. One of the things I do is I collect documents that attempt to get people to read in the here and now. Government reports, NGOs writing on literacy. I collect them all. On Saturday nights when you're all out partying, I got a very poor social life, and I sit at home collecting my documents. And what's interesting about these documents is that they all say the same thing. For example, a very recent government report that's called The Pleasure of Reading doesn't talk about pleasure, at least not the way that I understand it. It says reading is good for your health. It's got incredibly good mental health benefits. It's good for the economy. It's important for the skills that you're going to have on the job. So all the reasons as to why reading is good have got nothing to do with anything that's integral to the act of reading, or anything that's integral to literature or to the books. In other words, all the arguments that we're using as to why you should read are entirely external to the cultural experience of reading. And what that tells me, and this is what I conclude in the book, is that we can no longer have a language that can give meaning to the love of reading. Now, if you don't believe me, if you think I'm making this up, I suggest you do this. You go online, and online there's an instrument that you can use called Google Ngram. Google Ngram. Now, Google Ngram, the way that it works is you type in 2 words, and it will tell you over 200-300 years about how rarely or how often those words were used in different books and different newspapers. So when you put in love of reading into Google, and it's a wonderful research device. When you put in the love of reading into Google Ngram, what you get is like this. It's like in the 19th century, and 50s it goes up again, 56. From that point onwards, it just goes down and down and down. And what that tells us is that we very rarely talk about the love of reading, in a kind of normal, everyday kind of a way. And why is that? The reason why that is because we haven't got the kind of the spiritual or the intellectual or the moral capacity to make the love of reading come alive. And that's why we fall back upon arguments about health. Imagine a 14-year-old being told, read this book because it's good for your mental health. I mean, what kind of planet, sort of, do people think they're living on when that's what's being suggested? You still are. So, yeah.
But when I was young, there was no competition from other means, like the computer. All the children have laptops, and what I find from my experience with my grandchildren is that all the time they're on their little laptops and they're doing games. And how to get them, to wean them from that to reading a book, although their parents are very good at taking them to libraries, reading them a bedtime story, the children are almost all obsessed with their little laptops. And how do we wean them from that? It's this age, isn't it, of technology?
I'm not sure. I would not want to wean them from games, because when I was young, we used to have all kinds of games. They weren't digital games, but we would have pick-up sticks, or we would go and make things out of objects we found in nature. I used to spend almost all of my childhood playing with toy soldiers and going to war with them, with other boys. So we also had a lot of games that we were engaged in. I don't think that time-wise, we wasted more time than children waste today. It's called play, by the way, where we kind of play. It's just that playing today assumes a character that's very alien to me and to you, because what they're doing seems to be pointless. What are they doing? Well, they're doing what you and I were doing when we were children. You were dressing dolls, maybe, or maybe you were playing cowboys and Indians. There's a lot of things we were doing, but that is the functional equivalent of what children are doing today. So I'm not really worried. What I am worried about is that, sort of, in addition to playing, which is fine, what we haven't got is a kind of young people's culture where reading is kind of taken seriously. One of the things I've been looking at are the books that children used to read in the 50s and the 40s and even the 60s. And if you look at the vocabulary, and if you look at the metaphors, and if you look at the sentence structure of those texts and compare them to now, it is a different world. I really think that a very large percentage of children's literature is not very good. It is very sad that children are being given this, because they rely phenomenally on drawings and various kind of gimmicks, and make very little attempt to introduce an element of complexity into their lives through the words that they're being used. So I think that the problem is not the laptops, but that there isn't something that supplements that, that is kind of occurring, and I think that's what we should be kind of concerned about. As it happens, when children are on laptops, they are reading as well. They do read quite a lot. When you go to Leeds train station and you see all these people texting to each other, they are reading and writing, not necessarily the most worthwhile, sort of, but they are reading, and they can still read, but we're not giving them an inspiring alternative to what is really kind of going on. So I'm not anti-technology at all. I'm a big fan of technology, and I look forward to the day, when a more sophisticated literary culture and technology get married and have lots of nice, interesting children.
I think we're actually out of time. If there are any more questions. Yeah.
I was just thinking, for hundreds of years, reading was seen as dangerous. The Bible was, if it was translated into English, people were sort of killed for translating the Bible into English. And then now, reading the problem is seen as people not reading. I'm just wondering, when did that shift occur between reading, not reading, seen as a problem?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, because until the 1950s, the problem was that people read too much, it was dangerous, it was subversive, it was, sort of, kind of seductive. All kinds of arguments were used as to why, certain books had to be banned. It's very rare, when we ban a book these days. On the contrary, you can produce 50 Shades of Grey, and you can have, which would have been banned in any society, anywhere in the world, up till about 1960. You can produce those books and nobody cares. Nobody bats an eyelid. Today, what we're worried about is that people are not reading enough. So it's a fundamental change has occurred. And I think that change occurs precisely at a time when in Western society there's a major cultural crisis kind of occurring, where, in a sense, books are no longer the disturbing and the challenging aspects of a literary culture are disassociated from each other, and where increasingly the cultural value of reading is called into question by significant sections of society. And I think at that point, reading is kind of seen as just a skill. The number of times I hear the word skill applied to reading, or a literary skill, is phenomenal. And we have to remember that reading is not a skill, right? Plumbing is a skill, engineering is a skill. You can have language skill, but reading is not a skill. Reading is not the simple decoding of a text, which is what a skill is. Reading is about being able to read between the lines. It's about gaining meaning. It's about something much more important than that. And the fact that we talk about reading as a skill throughout the educational system indicates that to some extent the people that run our institutions of education have lost the plot as far as
That's been part of the debate, isn't it? So we've decontextualised the teaching and we've looked at phonics in great depth, but we don't have a language that can be easily taught through phonics, because with every invasion we took on the words of those invaders and we took on their spelling patterns. So there are cases, if we apply phonics right across the system, children use it for a short time and then they're able to look and say. They're then able to see the word, know the word and say it. But if we make them say it phonetically, that's not what they need to read. They need to read the word as it is.
Well, yes, and I think I'm a pluralist when it comes to teaching or reading.
Yeah.
I think a bit of phonics is fine, as long as it's kind of linked to the love of literature. I think the problem is how you create a context within which reading occurs. That's a key thing. So not only that, but I think with different people use different techniques.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I think
factory.
we just have to be open-minded and teach reading in accordance with the circumstances you find your students in. I think that's a key thing.
Thank you. You're saying that and a lot more, and this is a very, very interesting read. So if anybody wants to continue the conversation with you or wants to purchase one of the books, they're here. But could we first all join together in thanking Frank for coming and sharing.
Thank you. Thanks.